So it was Halloween in 1987, and I was in 6th grade. And when I was in 6th grade, I don't know where you were at in 6th grade, but the place I was at is I was somewhere between cool and not cool. I'm certain I was not cool, and I'm pretty certain I was not cool. I was somewhere in the middle. And sometimes I would say things that made my friends laugh. Other times I said things that would make them think I was just a fool. Sometimes I got picked for the cool kids team, and other times I definitely did not. Sometimes my friends were some cool, popular kids, and other times they were definitely not. So I was somewhere in the middle. And in Halloween of 1987, this was a critical time for my social status. Because I wasn't sure if I was going to be invited to Josh Wickland's Halloween party. And if anybody was to be your friend, if you wanted to be popular and to be cool, you wanted Josh Wickland to be your friend. So I was waiting to find out, am I going to be invited to Josh's Halloween party? And I kept my ears tuned for whether I was going to be invited. And I was listening, and I was watching, and I was trying to see how he interacted with me at school and what people were saying. And one day I actually overheard him talking to some other people about whether or not I was going to be invited, or whether people were going to be invited, who his invitation list was. And unfortunately, I couldn't hear if my name was mentioned or not. So I was just wondering, am I invited? Am I not? Am I cool? Am I not? I just didn't know. One day I got home, a few days before Halloween, and I had a letter, a small letter, in the mail addressed to me. And it was an invitation to Josh Wickland's Halloween party. And I was so excited. And so I spent those next couple days getting together the best costume and getting all prepared so that I was all ready. I planned out who I was going to go with to the party to make sure I went with the right person. I planned out what I was going to say and who I was going to talk to. I thought about how am I going to act, how am I going to look, how am I going to feel. I mean, 6th grade. But I was so excited and I was all in. And Jesus talks about us being all in. And he has a word for us as followers of Jesus, for us being all in. He's describing something that's a changed life, that's a big decision, and something that's a huge investment. And this word is a step that he wants every one of us to take as we strive to follow Jesus. And we've been talking about steps for the last few weeks. All these steps to take to be part of RiverCross Church. These steps that God wants us to take in order for all of us together to be the church that God calls us to be. We've talked about several steps, and these are the steps that we believe are the simple, basic 3 steps that we take to be part of God's work at RiverCross Church. So we've said things like worship, and connect, and serve. And about those things, we've said that when we step into worship, we step into worship together deeply. We worship together fully. We worship together fully, and the job that we have is to give God glory when we come to worship. Our job is to give God glory. We talked about stepping into connect, where we connect deeply with each other. We connect to the point where our relationships cause our faith to grow. And unless our faith isn't growing, we're not stepping in deeply enough. And then we talked about the fact that we step in to serve radically. That if we've been served as radically as Christ has served us, then we might as well radically serve others in just as radical ways. So we've talked about these things, these 3 steps. But there's another step that Jesus gives us that's sort of the all-in step. As if worshiping and connecting and serving, those are good steps. But if there's an all-in step, an all-encompassing step that shows that we are all in to this life with Jesus, this is the step. And it's the step of becoming a disciple. And if you think, I've heard that word before, then of course, we're right. We have heard that word before. And then if we think, I'm not so sure that being a disciple is that big of a deal. That's where we're so wrong. Because being a disciple is a huge deal. In fact, discipleship is all over the New Testament. As we read through the Gospels, discipleship comes up constantly, almost 300 times, just in the Gospel stories and in Acts. Disciples are described or mentioned. Jesus just has this disciple-like mentality. He called together 12 disciples as a core group. He called together 72 disciples and sent them out to serve. He calls people to follow him as disciples specifically. And then there's this group, if you remember, there's this group called the crowd. Like that's the large, big group that huddled around and followed Jesus wherever Jesus went. They were not called disciples. They were called the crowd. So there's somewhere a distinction between people who are disciples and people who are just part of the crowd. So there's a difference that happens when we become a disciple of Jesus. And it's a difference in taking a step to become a disciple. Now, disciples were everywhere in Jesus' world. In fact, they knew what disciples were and how disciples worked. Philosophers, for example, of the day, they had these young students, these pupils that would follow them as disciples. They would be people who learned from them. They would follow how they acted. They'd learn how the philosopher thought, and they would copy them. And that was the job of the philosopher, to have some students, some disciples, who followed them along. Other authorities and teachers and leaders of the day also had disciples as well. People who did the same things. They learned from them, they lived their lives, they learned how they thought, and they copied them. That was the world of discipleship. But you know who really had discipleship down? It was the Jewish people. They really understood what discipleship was. And they practiced it because they were highly motivated to call disciples and to do discipleship. There was a lot at stake. Because for them, obeying the law and learning the law was the way to a good relationship with God. God set up the relationship. If you obeyed, then you were doing well at that relationship. And in order to know the law, you had to know certain things. And so they set up a whole educational system that until the age of 13, the synagogues would sponsor an educational system. And it was religious education. It was not what we would call, public education. They didn't have public education. They had religious education. And so for the Jewish student, until the age of 13, they would go to their school. And they would learn specifically about the law. And in order to know the law, you had to know Hebrew. And in order to know Hebrew, you had to learn a brand new language. Because the language of their day was Greek. So you had to learn a whole new language in order to understand how to be in a relationship with God. Does that take a lot of time? Yes. Does it take a lot of time to learn the 600 plus laws of God and learn how to follow them? Absolutely. So it took years. And they said by the age of 13, every child or adolescent or youth should be able to, on their own, make decisions about how to follow God. So we will educate in these ways until the age of 13, and at that point they are an adult, they are independent, and they know everything that they need to know in order to fully follow God and be in a relationship with God. Those people were disciples. They were disciples to learn the ways and the laws of God. Well, there was another level to discipleship, though, because if you wanted to learn more about a relationship with God, if you wanted to take this to the next level and to really get serious about your faith, then you would talk to a rabbi and you would say, I want to be your disciple. Or sometimes a rabbi would say, I want to invite you to be my disciple. And so they would follow along in this partnership and they would live life together. They would follow, the disciple would follow the rabbi around. They would learn from each other. And the disciple would literally live with the rabbi. They would learn their life, they would learn how they thought, they'd learn all the specific little details of how to follow the law when the Bible didn't say necessarily how to follow this or that. This is what they learned. And they were specifically called disciples who did this sort of work. So, when Jesus called disciples, these people knew exactly what he was talking about. Because it was all around them. They had seen this happen. Their friends had been disciples. They had seen disciples grow up and learn. So they knew exactly what to expect. except Jesus is not in the habit of doing what we expect. So of course, in good Jesus style, he makes discipleship just a little bit different. And we're going to look at how he makes it different. We're going to look at 3 passages that sort of walk us through the progression of Jesus introducing what a disciple is. And by the end, we get to see what Jesus means by a true disciple. So we're going to start with Matthew chapter 4. There are 3 passages. Only the last one is printed in your bulletin. But if you'd like, you can flip open to Matthew chapter 4, verse 18 through 22. It'll also be on the screen. As Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw 2 brothers, Simon called Peter and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. "Come, follow me," Jesus said, "and I will send you out to fish for people." At once they left their nets and followed him. Going on from there, he saw 2 other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. They were in a boat with their father Zebedee, preparing their nets. Jesus called them, and immediately they left their boat and their father and followed him. Now, just as a rabbi would, Jesus invites people to follow him as disciples. And they do exactly what they would have understood is the plan. Jesus invites them. They leave these things behind that they're doing because they know it's going to take a lot of time. They leave their job. They leave their family, evidently. And we don't know the whole conversation that happened. Matthew just gives us enough of what we need to know to show that they knew what they were getting into. They knew that they were dropping certain things to follow Jesus. So this is exactly what they would have expected as far as a disciple. So fast forward a while, Jesus is now debating with some Jewish leaders. And Jesus highlights again what it means to be a disciple. John chapter 8. So you can flip ahead to John chapter 8, just a couple verses there. To the Jews who had believed him, Jesus said, "If you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." If you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples. Does that sound like the disciple system that they had going? Hold to my teaching, learn from me, copy me, learn what I do, think how I think, live my life, then you're really my disciple. It's exactly what they understood. They would have said, well, yes, of course. I live, I learn, I copy, and I will be your disciple. And then Jesus says, and you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. If you go ahead in the passage, the Jewish people actually object to Jesus and say, no, what's wrong with you? We're not slaves to anything. We don't need to be set free. So we get this idea that maybe Jesus is suggesting that there's more to discipleship than just learning some information and copying a lifestyle. There's something bigger to this discipleship that actually sets us free. But Jesus doesn't say what it is. He doesn't give us the details or the specifics. A while later, there is one of the most important conversations that happens in almost all the Gospels. And it's kind of interesting that it's basically in the middle of every Gospel. In Matthew, it's in chapter 16, which is right in the middle. In Mark, it's in 8, which is right in the middle. In Luke, it's either 12 or 15. It's right in the middle of Luke. It's sort of like the mountaintop where the Gospel starts and goes up to the important conversation and then sort of winds down. It's the conversation when the disciples discover and say who Jesus is. It's that big conversation when Peter realizes, oh my goodness, you are Jesus. You are this one that God sent. You are the one who's going to save the world. And in Peter's mind, he's thinking, you are the one, Jesus, who's going to make everything good. There's no more suffering. There's no more problems. There's no more evil. There's no more bad stuff that happens. You bring good. And so all now we need to think about is that good things are going to happen because of Jesus, because of you. You are God's gift. So Peter realizes this, and in response to that, Jesus essentially says, if you've taken this step of faith to say who I am and understand who I am, then I need to explain something to you about what it means to be the Savior of the world. Jesus needs to explain to Peter what it really means about who he is. And Peter says, so he starts to explain, that the Messiah, the Son of God, will suffer. And Peter responds, well, no, that's not supposed to happen because you're supposed to bring the good stuff. And no suffering and no pain and all the great things that are supposed to happen in life. And then, in Matthew chapter 16, this is the end of the conversation. This is in your bulletin, or you can flip to Matthew chapter 16, verse 23 to 25. Jesus turned back to Peter and said, "You are seeing things merely from a human point of view, not from God's. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it." This is discipleship. Deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow Jesus. Deny ourselves, take up our cross, follow Jesus. And if this is the kind of discipleship that Jesus is calling his followers to be, if this is what being an all-in kind of disciple looks like, then we need to know exactly what Jesus means. Most of the time, I don't think Jesus creates formulas for how to follow him. If you read through the Gospels, I don't think Jesus says, here's the 8 steps to take, or here's the order, and if you take this one, and then you take this one, and then you take this one, you're in. That's not, Jesus objects to that, right? That's what Jesus says, no, you don't do that. So Jesus is not like a formula. He doesn't present formulas for how to do things. And I think that's the key to understanding this passage. Because there's 3 steps: deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow Jesus. But I don't think it's a formula. Here's why. Look at the first one. I think we all know what it means to deny ourselves, to take the attention off of ourselves. It's not easy to do, of course, but I think we can all at least figure it out. We aren't the focus. Our concerns are not the priority. Our plans and our perspective and our hopes and our dreams, they are not the most important, even though sometimes we think they are. They are not the most important in God's plan and in God's scheme and in us following Jesus. Denying ourselves is about making sure that we are not in first place, but denying ourselves is making sure that God is in first place. So we fade so that God comes into first place. We must have God's concerns in mind. That's denying ourselves. Okay, now skip to the third. That was denying ourselves, skip the middle, and go to the third. Go to follow Jesus. I think we can figure this one out too. Hard to do, but we can figure out what it means. Embedded in Jesus is a way. Jesus is the way and the truth and the life. Jesus has a life for us to live, and our job is to follow it. Like Ryan did, we can play Simon Says. We can follow the things that Jesus says. We can obey, and Jesus desires that we follow in his life and in his style and in his path. And so when we become less important and our ways become less important, Jesus' ways become more important. Our ways fade to the background so that Jesus' ways come to the foreground and become more important. Does that sound like the first one? Deny ourselves so that God comes into first place. Our ways fade so that Jesus comes into first place. I think they're saying exactly the same thing. They're not 2 separate steps. They're saying the same thing. So now go to the middle one. Take up our cross. Take up our cross. I think that's often the most confusing one. And it would have been completely shocking to the people of Jesus' day, because they understood the system of learn, copy, live a life, follow, but there was nothing about taking up a cross in the whole discipleship plan of the first century. Philosophers didn't ask people to take up a cross. Jewish people didn't ask anybody to take up a cross because they knew exactly what it meant to take up a cross. It meant death. It meant pick up your crossbeam because you were sentenced to death, walk to where the stake is, and get pinned up on the cross. That's what it meant. There was no other way of understanding it. So for Jesus to say, if you want to be my disciple, take up your cross, Jesus is talking about death. But what kind of death? What is he getting at? Why death? Death to what? Death because of what? What if the first, the second, and the third piece of this deny yourselves, take up your cross, and follow me are saying exactly the same thing? It's not three separate steps. What if take up your cross is pick up all our ways, pick up all of our preferences, all of our plans, all the things we want, carry them to a place of death so that Jesus can take the place of life in us. Deny ourselves so God can take first place. Take up our cross so that our preferences and our ways are not on the table anymore. And follow Jesus so that Jesus has first place in our life. It's all the same thing. And it's all about us becoming second place and Jesus becoming first place. Deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow Jesus. That's a disciple. That's an all-in kind of disciple. And I think there's a debate out there in the jewelry world. I don't know if you've noticed the debate, I'm sure most of you have. You've seen that most people who like to wear jewelry and who follow Jesus, or even people who just like jewelry, will wear what kind of necklace? A cross. Now the debate out there, and if you're wearing a cross, don't worry, I'm not harping on crosses. The debate out there goes like this. I follow Jesus, and I'm not so sure people should be wearing crosses, because the cross isn't the end of the story. The tomb is the end of the story, because the cross is where Jesus died, and that's sort of the middle of the story. But the empty tomb, now that's the end of the story, because that shows that Jesus was raised from the dead and lived a new life, so we should all wear empty tombs around our necks or on our wrists. And you can get an empty tomb. And you can go to a jeweler, and they're all over. You can get an empty tomb and wear one. But I'm not convinced that the cross is a bad symbol to wear. Because if we're called to take up our cross, as Luke says, we're called to take up our cross daily and follow Jesus. And if that's the call of an all-in disciple, then I think we should wear a cross all the time. The cross is probably the best symbol of what it means to be a disciple and a follower of Jesus. If our lives can bear the cross, I think we're being disciples. We've been in this habit the last couple of weeks of talking about what it means to be the beginning of RiverCross Church's founding members. And many of you have said that you would like to be a founding member and have committed to that, and you etched a stone last week. I know not everybody was able to. We have some actually this week you can etch a stone. But our purpose with this was to do something defining to say, I am in, and I am part of this work that God is doing. And so we had stones made in order to represent each of us, that together we are the foundation that God is creating of RiverCross Church. It's not about us, and we want to fade, but we want to be the foundation so that God becomes first place. So here's our next step of what we're doing with this whole stones and cross. We have a cross, and one of the people in our church made this cross. And this is the cross where we will place our stones. We will lay them in the tray, and eventually they will become all of the founding members and the stones of RiverCross Church. So what I would invite you to do is, if you did make a stone last week, it is back. It is not finished yet, but it will be finished soon. And what I invite you to do after the service is to go find your stone. And the cross will be over there on the table. I invite you to take the stone and just lay it in the tray of the cross, if you've made one. If you haven't and you would like to be a founding member, please make a stone. There are some over there that you can etch your name or your initials or something into. As you do this, whether you made one last week or you make a fresh one this week, you can put those in here. Just set it in there, and I encourage you to just say a real simple prayer. Something like, God, lead me to take up my cross this week. as a way of saying, God, I am a disciple of yours. I'm all in to this relationship, and I'm all into the work that you're doing through this church. So it'll be over there after the service, and I encourage you to do that. Our goal, our call, is to be disciples of Jesus. And I know many of us are disciples of Jesus, but this is a daily task. This is the reason that we pray prayers like, God, I give my life to you. I accept you as my Lord and Savior. I ask you to cleanse me from sin and make me new. And that's why we recommit prayers like that, to say, God, I need you again today, because once again, I need you to be Lord of my life. Being a disciple, this way of following Jesus and being a disciple, that's exactly why we do these things. And every one of us needs fresh and new opportunities to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. Let's pray.